Chapter 1.1, we'll be going over line, shape, and the principle of contrast. So basically, talking about the elements of art, that's and the principles of art, this is the stuff that we're going to talk about to describe the work and to communicate what the artist is doing. So the elements of art are the basic vocabulary of it, so you identify it. And then the principles of art is how the elements of art are organized, right? And so this is we consider the grammar, right? And so an example would be line, right? Line is the vocabulary, it's the element. And then the principle of art of line would be the things that line does. So line creates contrast. So that's how we're going to identify these and then tell us how they're utilizing line, how they're utilizing color, and what they're creating. So just remember that with two-dimensional art, we are talking about a flat surface, right? There is no depth. And that's important because when we talk about line, not only does line connect 2 points, but we're also looking at the idea of what an artist is doing with that line, right? So defining boundaries between planes, defining shapes, directing the viewer's eye, and also conveying the sense of movement, right, and energy. And so this will be important when you're doing your analysis because you'll be able to talk about what line is doing. So the first type of line that we'll talk about is contour line. So basically a contour line is the edge of an object, right? So say that you are drawing a bottle, you're just drawing the outer edge of that bottle, and that would be the contour of it. And so with contours, they could look flat, but they also could suggest volume and space. So it gives us clues about how the surface and the character of the piece, right? And so these are the things that you would talk about, right? So for example, if you were doing an analysis on this and I asked you, how did Henri Matisse create volume, right? You could talk about the use of contour, right? And so how does that contour line create that, right? So the solid continuous lines create this three-dimensional shape and surface, right? And so you're looking at this drawing and we understand that it's a flat surface, but that contour actually gives us that illusion of that kind of volume, right? That we understand that there's volume in the figure, there's volume in her hair. So again, we can look at the hair and you can see the examples of the curls, right? So that illusion of like creating volume in the hair. Another type of line that we'll talk about is implied line. And so implied line basically is a line that's not really there, right? So it's implied by a series of marks. So this gives the illusion or the impression that the line is there, but it's not. So these would be examples of implied line, right? So this would be an actual line, and then this would be an implied line, right? So the dots, just if we were to connect them, you could say that it's a line. It's implied, right? The same thing with these dashes here, and then also with these so like if you think about if you were driving down the street and you're looking at the poles, telephone poles, they would create an implied line. There's not really a line there, but it's implied, right? And so we're going to identify the implied lines in some work and then talk about what they do, right? And so this is another example of implied lines. And again, it's all created with writing, right? So he's carefully putting the writing in there and then creating the illusion that there is a line there, right? So it's implied, it's not really there, but it's implied. The other type of line that we'll talk about is directional line. And so with directional line, artists use that line to direct your attention to a particular part of the work. So, for example, if we were looking at this piece right here, right? They are on a high rise, right? This is James Allen, the connectors. And so if you look at this, you know, your eye starts up here, but then these beams kind of go down and create that illusion because you're starting to look down, right? And why is that important in this piece, right? Because it's talking about the idea of this extreme height, right? These guys are out there building, and it's a really high, right? So that dangerous occupation that they have, but it's forcing you to look down, right? And so by doing that, he accentuates that height, right? And so even like the background buildings reinforce that same effect because they're kind of faded. And the idea that they're faded creates that illusion of space and depth, right? So this is an example of what lines can do, right? And what they communicate. So line can communicate direction and movement. If you look at this piece right here, it's the same thing. The attention is going to different sections, right? And so depending on how you're looking at it, right? If you're looking at all these lines kind of converging into the middle of the picture, then you could either say that he's falling in or that he's falling out, right? These kind of arrows kind of coming up could suggest that maybe he's coming out, like flying out of that space or something, right? Maybe there's an explosion. But again, what the artist is doing is using those lines intentionally so that we as the viewer can understand that there's some sort of action or movement happening. Lines can also communicate different things, right? So, for example, vertical lines tend to communicate strength, whereas horizontal lines can suggest like peacefulness, calmness. So if you think about a beach, horizontal lines, they're very peace, calm. And then diagonal lines are associated with action, motion, and change, right? And so if you think about that drawing that we just saw, those diagonal lines also create that idea of action. So when you're looking at a painting or a drawing, artwork, think about the line, like the structure of it, even if it was like a sculpture, right? And the sculpture is vertical, it's very straight. We can communicate that idea of stability, authority, strength, right? Whereas if we were looking at a painting and it's a landscape and it's horizontal, we can talk about that idea of like it's peaceful, maybe passive, and so very calming, right? And so the artist will intentionally use these different lines to communicate these things, right? So if we're looking at like comics and stuff like that, you see a lot of diagonal lines, right? It's communicating movement and action, right? And so when we're doing our analysis, we're thinking about, okay, what type of line are we looking at and what is it communicating? Or what type of line is the artist using and what is the effect, right? What is it creating? So this example right here is a great example of diagonal lines, right? It's the Nike logo, right? And so it's a really clever design. If you think about that idea of diagonal lines, they express excitement, right? So again, you think about the athlete movement action, right? And so by using that diagonal, the artist can communicate that, right? This is Vincent van Gogh, The Bedroom, right? And so in this piece right here, the idea of the use of line as well, right? You see we're on, like on the floor, for example, these lines are kind of converging to the back, right? They're not straight though. They have some sort of like, they're a little off, right? And then so if you look at kind of the rest of the lines, most of the lines are like very strong verticals, right? We're seeing these kind of vertical lines, but they're still a little off, right? So you know that it's not a calm place, because if it was calm and peaceful, we would have had a lot of diagonal, right? Which we don't have in this piece, right? So we kind of have these like kind of off strong vertical lines, and then So if you think about the idea of these like very uneasy lines, right, communicates that idea of like that he's uneasy, maybe, right, that there's something off, right, maybe kind of even for some people like create some sort of anxiety, maybe, right, that it's not a stable place, right, and so kind of have to kind of look at stuff like this and decide on what the artist used and then what it's reading, right, what usually these lines, and sometimes it's going to contradict itself, right, and so I'll show you an example of so different lines, right, regular lines, they express control and planning. And so if we were looking at regular lines, for example, right, these are an example of regular lines, right, and so if they're supposed to represent control and order, here we look at these and it's like, wait a minute, there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? And so what Mal Bochner does is he repeats and overlaps these regular lines, right? And by doing that, he's creating this feeling of disarray, right? And so it looks like it's been drawn with a ruler, right? It's a straight edge. These lines are straight. And so in our head, we understand that, oh, straight lines are supposed to be controlled. And so they're controlled here. I mean, they're done with a ruler, but they're repeated, overlapping, and again, very important, diagonal, right? Diagonal lines, action, movement. And this is what's creating that, right? And so this is what I'm looking for in your analysis when I ask you, like, what does, is the line important in the piece? What does it create? So an irregular line would be the opposite of a regular line, right? And so with irregular lines, we usually talk about the idea of like expression, freedom, passion, right? So they're just very unrestrained. They're very passionate. You think about like a child drawing. They're not thinking about anything. They're just going with the flow, right? That's an example of irregular lines. So here, Andre Mason is talking about that same idea of the subconscious, right? And so he actually goes without food and water for a few days so that he can really kind of hone into the subconscious and do these really automatic drawings, right? They're very spontaneous and very free. So with regular lines and irregular lines, that's also a great example of how using both of them can create contrast, right? And so other things to think about, right? In this piece, the man-made geometric shapes, right? Regular lines, and then the nature irregular lines, right? So both contrasting each other, right? In shape, we also have the same idea of organic shapes and geometric shapes. So just remember that organic shapes are very unpredictable, they're irregular, whereas geometric shapes are more mathematical, very precise. We think about man-made. In these pieces, you see again the idea of contrast with organic shapes, flowers, and then these geometric shapes in the back. In shape, we also have implied shapes. So just like we have an implied line, we also have implied shapes. And so this would be an example of implied shape. It looks like maybe it's the AT&T logo. It could be the universe or the globe, a world, sphere. And the last thing to think about is contrast, right? So when an artist is using two different elements, right, it's going to apply the principle of contrast. So if you have two noticeable principles, right, so regular line and irregular line, those are two. They're very different. If you have geometric and organic, we have two different things. And so it's creating contrast, right? Positive and negative shapes also will create the idea of contrast, right? And so if you look at this piece, for example, right, you have the positive and then the negative. You see the gun, and then you see the man bleeding from his mouth, right? And so this is gun crime.